In Beirut, and she's been telling me what's known about the impact of the airstrikes in Syria.
Well, they definitely did the damage for the use of chemical weapons. They've sent a strong message to the government of President Bashar al-Assad for it not to use these prohibited weapons in Syria anymore. But did it affect the course of the war or the position of President Bashar al-Assad? Definitely not. This is a warning for the president and his forces not to use chemical weapons, but it says nothing about using other conventional weapons. And we've seen over the past 7 years the highest number and the vast majority of civilians killed, reaching around 500,000 over the past 7 years. They were killed in conventional weapons, not with chemical weapons. So for the course of the war, for the peace in Syria, they're not making any difference. But for the security of using chemical weapons, yes, definitely they're sending a very strong message to the government.
And Lena, we saw those pictures yesterday appearing to show President Assad going to work as normal. And the message from the Syrian regime seems to be business as usual.
Well, yes, that's definitely the case. I mean, you watch what they're broadcasting and the messages that they're sending, and you talk to people on the ground. It is a message of defiance. It's a message to tell the aggression, as they call it, that we're here to stay and we're continuing. And of course, this is the case, to be honest, because at the end of the day, it's only 3 sites, according to the Americans, that were targeted. None of the military bases, none of the air forces. So his military and power is still up and running. He still has the support from Russia and Iran, and he's still going to win the war. He had full control of Douma yesterday, the area that witnessed the chemical attack last week. So nothing changed for him. Only the use of chemical weapons will stop, but we're not sure if he's going to commit to it in the future.
Lena Sinjab in Beirut. Here, the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson has strongly defended the use of airstrikes, saying that they were necessary to deter chemical weapons being used in Syria. Our political correspondent Mark Lebel explains more.
He said about the airstrike, it's sending a message to the world that enough is enough. He says there's an overwhelming reason why it was the right thing to do in Syria. He was asked if the UK was locked and loaded, as they are in America, for another attack. He said he hoped that it would be enough of a deterrent not to happen again. So again, leaving the door open to a future strike if there was perhaps another suspected chemical weapons attack in Syria. But he made one point about the wider war in Syria. Let's have a listen to this clip.
I think it's important to understand the limits of what we're trying to do.
This is not about to end the war.
That's right, Andrew. And I think that this is not going to, we must be honest, this is not going to turn the tide of the conflict in Syria. One can hope that it encourages the Russians to get Assad to the negotiating table in Geneva, to get a political process properly going. But that is as it were, an extra. The primary purpose is to say no to the use of barbaric chemical weapons.
You heard a bit of it there. He's treading a fine line with the Russians. You know, he was talking about conversations that did take place before the airstrikes so that nothing was escalated on that front, but did say at one point contacts with the Russians have not been good. Still very frustrated that they won't, with what he called the extraordinary weight of evidence in the Skripal case, the chemical poisoning in Salisbury, that the Russians still are denying involvement in that. So kind of frustration, but you got a sense that he was having to hold it back.
Now, Labour have been talking about this as well, particularly Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party leader. What's he had to say?
That's right. Well, Jeremy Corbyn was asked a lot about these strikes, but one interesting line that he was that came out of a question from Andrew Marr, which we'll listen to in a second, is if you bear in mind that he was chairman of Stop the War for a long time and seen by many people as a pacifist and, of course, facing the prospect of possibly being Prime Minister, he was asked directly whether he would never say never on military action. Let's take a listen.
If you were Prime Minister, you would never, ever authorise the use of force against countries.
No one would ever say never. What I would say is...
Almost never, though.
Well, no, what I would say is there has to be a process where the objective is to bring about peace, to bring about a resolution to conflict, to bring about a political solution. Listen, there's going to be no military winner in Syria. Well, the war could go on and get worse.
He continued to air his objections with what the government have done in Syria. The government have come forward saying the international law has allowed them to do what they've done based on humanitarian reasons. He said that was legally debatable. So then he was asked where he thought the legal basis for a strike would come from, and this is what he had to say.
I say to the Foreign Secretary, I say to the Prime Minister, where is the legal basis for this? The legal basis would have to be...
Humanitarian, they say.
Well, would have to be self-defence or the authority of the UN Security Council. The humanitarian intervention is a legally debatable concept at the present time. And I would have thought, from the point of recalling Parliament or waiting 2 days, things could have been different. But it looked awfully to me as though the Prime Minister was more interested in following Donald Trump's lead than anything else. And this is policy made up by Twitter.
So clearly suggesting that Theresa May being led by Donald Trump there. So what about tomorrow's statement that the Prime Minister is going to give? Well, Jeremy Corbyn saying there should have been a bigger role for Parliament. Parliament should have been recalled. He wants a vote for what happens next now, how the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons joins in and investigates what's happening now. He wants a UN resolution to bring Russia and America closer together. And he mentioned a War Powers Act, which he thinks should be brought in to hold the government account for their actions, including these types of strikes.
Mark Lebel there, our political correspondent. Well, I've been talking as well to Sir Mark Lyall-Grant, who was Britain's ambassador to the United Nations in 2013 when the Commons voted against military action in Syria. Now, he said it was right that the UK took part in these airstrikes without Parliament being consulted.
Frankly, this convention is a very recent convention and is a constraint that many of our allies, including France and the United States, don't face. The reality is that the situation in crises like this, security, defence crises, move very quickly and decisions need to be made very quickly. And it's very rare that all the information available to the government when coming to a decision will be able to be put into the public domain. So I think Parliament certainly should be holding the government to account for its executive decisions, but I don't think Parliament is the right body to take those executive decisions that naturally fall to the Prime Minister and her cabinet.
Was the Prime Minister also under pressure in the sense that the French and President Macron in particular seem very keen on military action, seems to be very close now to Donald Trump on this, and that we might have been slightly isolated if we hadn't joined in the military action and you know, more distant from the United States perhaps?
Well, there may be an element of that, and undoubtedly the United States was very supportive of the United Kingdom over the poisoning of the Skripals. And so clearly one wants to stand with one's allies in defending international norms. But I think there's a wider point here that is more significant, is that the rules-based international order is very important for countries like the United Kingdom, actually more important arguably for us and France and other European countries than it is for the United States. We rely entirely on that rules-based international order for our prosperity, for our security. So it is right that we should participate in defence of that order. And using chemical weapons is a very direct violation of that international order. So I think it's right that the British government should play a role in defending it.
But are these missile strikes really too late? We've seen, I think, you know, Karen Pierce, the British ambassador at the UN now, doing your old job, said that I think there'd been 50 chemical weapons strikes at least in Syria, maybe 200. This is a response to one. You know, what really is the point?
Well, it is important to draw a line in the sand on this. This was a particularly egregious chemical weapons attack. There was clear evidence that it was the Assad regime, so it was right to respond. But you're right, obviously, that this is not going to change the dynamic on the ground. It's not going to change the outcome of the Syrian civil war. And that's why I was so disappointed back in 2013 when Parliament did vote against military action. Because don't forget, that was 2 years before Russia entered the conflict at all. And military strikes then might have fundamentally changed the dynamic on the ground.
So in a way, that was the time.
That was the time, and that could have saved hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties in Syria. Now, unfortunately, that isn't possible, and so this was a much more limited objective, which was focused on chemical weapons only.
People will also say, you know, why this response on chemical weapons? Because Assad has been doing all sorts of horrific things to civilians in terms of conventional weapons for years, killing, as you say, hundreds of thousands.
Well, I think use of chemical weapons is a particularly strong international taboo. You know, they haven't been used in widespread terms since the First World War, but they were used again in the Second World War, and then, of course, in the Iran-Iraq War, and in smaller cases now in Syria. But, you know, given that every country practically in the world has signed up to the Chemical Weapons Convention, it's a particularly unpleasant way of killing people. And I think it's right that we should reinforce that taboo, that international taboo that everyone has agreed to.
Sir Mark Lyall-Grant, who was Britain's ambassador to the UN in 2013 when the Commons did vote against military action in Syria. Look at some other news now with the time at 14 minutes past midday. Sir Martin Sorrell, the highest paid boss of a British public company, has resigned after being investigated for personal misconduct. Sir Martin announced he had stepped down as chief executive of WPP with immediate effect, saying it was in the best interests of the business for him to go. Last year, WPP, the world's biggest advertising agency, cut his salary by nearly a third to just over £48 million. Our business correspondent Joe Lynham's been giving me more details on the significance of Sir Martin's departure.
The company announced that they were launching an internal investigation into accusations that funds of the company had been inappropriately used. Outside counsel was brought in to launch that investigation, and we now know that that investigation is now complete. It's been concluded. So we cannot infer that Sir Martin did anything wrong. In fact, he denies any wrongdoing whatsoever. He strenuously denies that. But he's stepping down for the sake of the company. He says he's going to leave it in much better hands and that now is the time to go. He is 73 years of age.
That salary figure has been hugely controversial, hasn't it?
Well, as you also said, that was a pay cut to £48 million. In 2016, he got £70 million. His salary is huge. He will say that the company is worth £15 billion today. That's a 32% drop from 1 year ago. So it was worth almost £20 billion 1 year ago. And he has raised it from nothing. So if you bought shares in wire and plastic products, which is WPP stands for, back 30 years ago, your growth would have been exponential. So he will say, I've given value to the shareholders. I'm worth that money as the driving force of a company which is in 112 countries around the world.
Joe Lynham, our business correspondent. A man has died and a woman's in a critical condition after the vehicle they were in collided with a car during a police pursuit on the outskirts of Stoke-on-Trent. The pair were being followed by officers on the A50 near Longton after their vehicle failed to stop. They collided with a car on the eastbound carriageway at around 6 this morning. Staffordshire Police have referred the incident to the Independent Police Complaints Commission, which is routine when somebody dies during an operation. Police have launched a murder investigation after a man was shot dead in Birmingham. Officers were called to a shooting in the Bawdsley area of the city at just after midnight. A 20-year-old man was pronounced dead at the scene. Forensic teams are carrying out investigations this morning and police are appealing to the public for information. And police are continuing to investigate after a car ploughed into a group of pedestrians in Essex. One person is still in a critical condition in hospital. Another has potentially life-changing injuries after the incident in Canvey Island yesterday afternoon. Ben Ando reports.
Crash investigators at the scene, marking down the track of a car that veered off the road and struck 6 people on the pavement just yards north of the seafront at Canvey Island. It's not clear what happened or why, but 5 of those hit were hurt, one critically, another with life-changing injuries, and a major incident was declared. 3 helicopters and 4 land ambulances were scrambled to the scene.
It is quite quiet along the seafronts. Yeah, I've not seen anything around here at all like this. I was quite shocked when I saw it. As soon as I saw the helicopters fly over, and I thought something's been serious.
In a tweet, Essex Police urged people to avoid the area, but so far have not commented on suggestions from some eyewitnesses that the driver involved was being chased by a patrol car at the time of the crash. The 2 most seriously hurt victims are now being treated in hospitals in London. So far, no one has been arrested. Ben Ando, BBC News.
Our headlines on BBC News. Locked and loaded, America tells Syria it's ready to strike again after yesterday's attacks